This committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up the bipartisan bill H.R. 3212. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3212, a bill to ensure compliance with the 1980 Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction by countries with which the United States enjoys reciprocal obligations, to establish procedures for the prompt return of children abducted to other countries and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open for amendment at any point. And after recognizing myself and the ranking member for brief remarks, I'll recognize the author, Mr. Smith, to explain the bill, and then any other members who seek recognition. And without objection, all members have 5 legislative days to submit statements for the record on any of today's business, and I now recognize myself to speak on the bill. Every year, more than 1,000 American families are confronted with the nightmare of their child being abducted to a foreign country by one parent in violation of legal custody and access rights. So they're out of reach of the United States, they're out of reach of our courts and of law enforcement, and this unilateral and illegal severing of the tie between the child and the left-behind American mother or American father is a tragedy. It is one that needs to be addressed. Many of us have constituents facing these wrenching separations. More than 30 years ago, the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of Child Abduction was created to provide a simplified consensus mechanism for returning children to their countries of habitual residence so that parental rights are determined by applicable laws rather than by acts of kidnapping. Today, the United States has agreements with 75 Hague partner countries which have helped to return many children safely home. But unfortunately, agreeing to the Hague Convention and complying with the Hague Convention are not the same thing, and countries often do not take their obligations to their commitment there with the Hague seriously enough. I'm going to let Mr. Smith describe the contents of his bill, but I want to thank him for the groundbreaking work he's done over the past 4 years in highlighting the unaddressed problems of Hague noncompliance and working to craft a responsible legislative approach. This bill will strengthen the incentives and the tools that the Department of State has to address unresolved abduction cases. Its enhanced annual reporting will also provide American parents and our judges with a clearer picture of actual Hague compliance and the risks of non-return associated with travel to certain countries. And I want to thank Mr. Smith, thank the bipartisan committee co-sponsors. Mr. Meadows worked on this, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Holding, Mr. Sherman, Mr. Vargas, for working so cooperatively with the ranking member and with me in the process. And I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Elliott Engel from New York, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything you just said about the bill, and I'd like to thank you for scheduling today's markup on H.R. 3212, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act. There are few crimes more heart-wrenching than child abduction, and as a parent, I cannot even imagine the anguish that someone goes through by having a child abducted by their partner and taken to another country. These left-behind parents have little leverage to have their children returned home. They're often at the mercy of foreign courts with different cultural conceptions of custody and arbitrary determinations for what is or is not in the child's best interest. Unfortunately, there is an increasing number of international parental child abductions where one parent leaves the United States and either wrongfully removes or retains a child abroad. According to the State Department, there were 1,144 children abducted from a parent in the United States and taken abroad in the year 2012 alone. The most effective tool the United States has to help return abducted children is the 1980 Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction. This treaty creates a global standard and requires signatories to return abducted children to the country of the child's habitual residence for a custody hearing. Regrettably, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, there are significant gaps in the Hague Treaty framework. 40% of abducted children are taken to non-Hague countries, leaving those parents with even fewer options. and the treaty has no enforcement mechanisms. The purpose of the legislation before us today is to fill those gaps. H.R. 3212 encourages the State Department to enter into MOUs with these countries to help bring them in line with Hague standards and return children home. It also gives the President the power to sanction countries that demonstrate persistent failure in returning abducted children. In addition, the legislation will help us monitor progress in achieving greater compliance worldwide with the Hague standards by requiring reports on child abduction cases and on U.S. government efforts to encourage that compliance. Sadly, international parental child abduction is an underreported and often overlooked crime which dramatically and traumatically impacts the lives of the children and parents involved. We need to send a message to the world that we take Hague compliance and returning abducted children back to the United States very seriously. This bill represents an important step forward in empowering the President and the State Department to enforce the Hague Convention and to bring more countries in line with its standards. I'd like to thank Mr. Smith for his tireless efforts on this important issue. I have spoken with him about this for many, many years and know the hard work that he's put into it and his heartfelt feelings about this. I want to thank other members who contributed as well. I want to single out Mr. Grayson for his positive contribution to the bill. So, Mr. Chairman, I support the measure and the amendment before us and encourage all members to vote in support of its passage. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We now go to the author of the bill, H.R. 3212, Subcommittee Chairman Chris Smith.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to thank you profoundly for bringing this legislation. You know, at a time when the government is shut down, we're alive and well and running, and the typically bipartisan way that you run this committee, and you and Ranking Member Engel are to be commended, and I thank you especially for bringing this bill to the full committee for consideration. I also want to thank all the members who have co-sponsored, and I especially want to thank a number of the family members who are here today, and I'll say a brief word about that in a moment. We are here this morning to mark up H.R. 3212, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act of 2013. This legislation mirrors legislation that I wrote back in 2000 called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is designed to combat the hideous practice of human trafficking, and to do so by holding countries to account. It also mirrors legislation authored by Congressman Frank Wolf, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, that in like manner holds countries to account for egregious behavior as it relates to human rights. And of course, here we're talking about child abduction. As our members are aware, this bill enjoys strong bipartisan support. Almost every member of the House, and many of us do have constituents that have come forward and asked for our help, are affected by the tragedy of international parental child abduction. Child abduction occurs when one parent takes a child from his or her home in the United States to another country, or wrongfully retains a child abroad in violation of the other parent's custody rights, often with the intent of depriving the other parent of access to the child. The damage to the child and the left-behind parents is incalculable and too often lifelong. The children are at risk of serious emotional and psychological problems, and many experience anxiety, eating problems, nightmares, mood swings, sleep disturbances, aggressive behavior, resentment, guilt, and fearfulness. Parental child abduction is child abuse. These victims are American citizens who need the help of their government in a more robust way, especially when normal legal processes are unavailable or fail. It was David Goldman's unrelenting, almost 6-year effort to bring his son, Sean, home from Brazil that has helped to highlight the epidemic of international parental child abduction. David, like other equally heroic parents, was absolutely tenacious. He is here in this room, and I thank him for the leadership that he has provided that has been extraordinary. But he was absolutely tenacious, but suffered setbacks and a numbing pain along the way. Right up to the very week before Sean was released, all of us were wondering, will it happen or will it not? Well, according to the U.S. Department of State, between the years 2000 and 2008 and 2012, bereaved left-behind parents like David reported over 4,800 abduction cases involving more than 7,000 American children. I had the privilege of joining David in his fight to return Sean and experienced firsthand the maddening obstacles encountered by left-behind parents, even in countries that have signed the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction. Foreign courts, endless appeals to run out the clock, exploitation of the safeguards in the convention, and prejudice against foreigners all block the way to bringing American children home. Too many families have been waiting too long for the return of their children. I see in the audience Captain Paul Toland, who has not been able to see his daughter Erica since 2004, despite the fact that he is her only living parent. So many other left-behind parents are here today, many of whom, like Captain Toland, long to be reunited with their children. In the room, too, and I didn't know he would be here, is a man, Mr. Feimster, the grandfather. His daughter's children were kidnapped. And this is a case, frankly, where the State Department and the Foreign Service officers involved did an extraordinary case and effectuated the return of his son, the two granddaughters who were kidnapped to Tunisia. So congratulations. At times, the system does work, but it is still broken in many ways. I also see in the audience Mr. Hermer, whose daughter is being held in the United Kingdom. Mr. Braden, I believe, will be here. Mr. Elias, Mr. Burns, and as I said, Mr. Feimster. Michael Elias, just one brief example, is a combat-injured Iraqi veteran, testified at one of my 4 hearings on abduction, saying, and I quote him in pertinent part, "As a father who no longer has his children to hold in his arms, I cannot deal with the sorrows, so I try my best to stay strong and keep fighting for their return. All of my hopes and dreams for their future now lie in the hands of others." He continued, "I am begging our government to help not only my family, but hundreds of other heartbroken families as well, to demand the return of American children." Today is our chance to help. H.R. 3212 backs with penalties our demands for adherence to international obligations and makes clear to friends and foes alike that our children are our top priority. As stated in the legislation, it has several purposes. First, we want to protect children whose habitual residence in the U.S. from the harmful effects of abduction and to assist left-behind parents to have access to their abducted children in a safe and predictable manner while an abduction case is pending. We want to provide left-behind parents, their advocates, and judges the information they need to enhance the resolution of abduction cases to establish legal procedures. An additional purpose of the bill would be to establish measured, effective, and predictable actions to be undertaken by the President on behalf of abducted American children and to promote international consensus that is in the interest of the children to have any issues related to their care and custody determined in the country of their habitual residence. And finally, the bill would encourage the effective implementation of international mechanisms, particularly those established pursuant to the Hague Convention, to achieve reciprocity in the resolution of abductions and to protect children from harmful effects of abduction. The Goldman Act gives the President important tools, and I have listed them in my comments, and I would ask the members to take a look at those, but they are derived from previous laws, including IRFA and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, so that there will be real clout behind our insistence that these children be brought back. So without objection, I would ask that my full comments be made part of the record, and again, I thank my colleagues.
I thank you, Mr. Smith. I think the full statement being in the record is a good concept because we face a pending conference here. I would remind the other members, if you have a statement to make, you can certainly put it in the record. And I would ask if any other members wish to speak at this time on the underlying bill before we recognize Mr. Grayson to offer an amendment.
Go to that side.
Yes. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Engel and particularly Mr. Smith for your years of leadership on this and clearly the passion and leadership that you've shown to make this day come a reality. I speak today in support of this bill and in particular on behalf of one of my constituents, Colin Bauer, a devoted father from Newton, Massachusetts, who has tirelessly sought the return of his 2 abducted children from Egypt. Mr. Bauer has worked to bring his children, Nora and Ramsey, home to the United States since since their mother unexpectedly took them out of school in 2009, boarded a plane just hours later, with tickets paid in cash, never to return. Despite a U.S. court ruling that gave full custody to Colin and a subsequent Egyptian court order granting him the right to visit his children, Colin has continually been denied the opportunity to see his boys and has not spoken to them in nearly 2 years. I offer my comments because Colin is not alone. The legislation before us would bolster international mechanisms critical to resolving international abduction cases. It would provide left-behind parents with a framework about how to work through the government to gain information about their cases and elevate this issue publicly to draw the necessary attention to the children and families that are torn apart. I thank Congressman Smith for all of your work once again and for offering this bill, and I ask my colleagues to support it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and we go to Ms. Ross-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our hero, Chris Smith, for bringing this important legislation for markup today. And I'll continue to battle with him on behalf of children who have been victims of transnational abduction and for the left-behind parents who feel helpless and all too often hopeless that their government won't use whatever tools available to reunite them with their children. But I would also like to urge that we do not overlook one of the most difficult issues in child abduction law. In many instances, a parent will flee with their child or children internationally in order to escape domestic violence. There's no simple solution for this issue, and it's indeed very complex and sensitive. Too often, current U.S. law addressing international child abduction actually facilitates domestic violence and child abuse by forcing the return of a child despite the recognized risks to the child or parent. That's why I'm planning to introduce legislation in the next few weeks to amend the federal law that would eliminate these unintended consequences. And I encourage my colleagues to join me in this effort, as well as helping Mr. Smith pass this important bill. It's my hope that with these bills and further corrective measures to international child abduction laws, that we will be able to resolve these issues so that the interests of the children and the left-behind parents and those who fear domestic violence and abuse can be protected. And I will put my statement for the record, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Ross-Layton. And any other members? Mr. Poe for 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with this legislation. For a long time, one of my constituents, Marty Pate, we've been working with him. His daughter was stolen by his ex-wife and taken to Brazil when she was 6 years old without legal permission. I'd like to introduce my entire statement into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I had a constituent, Tom Sylvester, whose daughter Karina was taken to Austria. This gentleman did everything right, fought it for years and years, went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Austria, and with decisions in his favor. We met with Colin Powell and with Madeleine Albright down at the State Department. He did everything right, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees, never got his daughter back. Your heart just goes out to these people that have to go through this horrific trauma, and I want to thank Mr. Goldman for fighting and thank Congressman Chairman Smith for taking this on as well. These are just heartbreaking cases. It got so frustrating, I literally would have said, let's send the Marines in to bring these kids back. And so thank you for introducing this legislation. I hope it does some good. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Grayson, do you have an amendment at the desk?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3212, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida. In Section 101B2G, insert.
Without
Chairman.
objection, the amendment is considered read, and Mr. Grayson is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that time is short and many of you have an engagement in 3 minutes, so I will submit my statement for the record.
Mr. Grayson, if I could just commend you for working with the author and working with the committee and the ranking member on your amendment. I think it improves the bill. Are there any further requests for recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes. Mr. Connolly.
I know we're in a rush. I have no idea what the Grayson Amendment is. If we're being asked to.
I'm going to ask Mr. Grayson to explain his amendment at this time. It is in your packet, but Mr. Grayson. go
Yes,
ahead for the
thank
good of the
you.
order to explain that amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment accomplishes three things. First, it strengthens the reporting requirements in the annual report on international child abduction. Second, it provides for congressional notification for each existing unresolved international child abduction case in each member's district, not merely the newly reported abductions as currently required by the unamended bill. And third, it provides the President with discretion to withhold economic support assistance to foreign governments unwilling to assist in resolving child abduction cases.
I thank the chair and I thank my colleague.
Any further comments or questions on the Grayson amendment or request to speak? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Grayson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Hearing no further amendments to this measure, the question now occurs on agreeing to H.R. 3212 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is, as amended, is agreed to. And without objection, this measure as amended is agreed to. It's ordered favorably reported and will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, and also without objection. Staff is directed to make technical and conforming changes, and the chairman is authorized to seek House consideration of 3212 under suspension of the rules. And again, I want to thank Ranking Member Engel, Mr. Smith, and all of our committee members for their contribution to this legislation and their assistance with today's markup. The committee is adjourned.